Today on The State of Us, China and Russia try to push aside America. Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined, of course, by the one and only senior resident historian and friendly redneck liberal, Mr. Lance L. Jackson. A very friendly redneck liberal today, as always, really. We're going to look at how Putin and President Xi in China aim for Russia and China partnership against the U.S., according to a recent report from the Wall Street Journal, and another commentary piece, opinion piece, by none other than Joe Lieberman, for those that don't know, former senator, and also the national co-chair for No Labels, an organization working to overcome partisanship in Washington, where he claims that 2022's biggest challenges come from Russia. So we're going to look at all that and more. But before we dive in, Lance, how are you going to expand our vocabulary today?
I am exasperated with this topic today. And that's our word of the day, exasperate. E-X-A-S-P-E-R-A-T-E. 4 syllables. It is a transitive verb. It means to irritate or to annoy very much, to make angry or to vex. Exasperate.
Exasperate. Okay. That's always one. I feel like that's an author's word. And I mean that in that, you'll see these places where they write, oh, they were exasperated by that, or whatever. But it's not one that you hear, I don't think, very frequently spoken conversation. It's written, and I'm sure a number of our listeners, but there's your challenge for today. Can you, other than right now, obviously us speaking it, can you think of a time where
you were exasperated?
Right. And have you ever used the word in conversation? I'm sure you've read it probably, but have you ever used it? Have you ever spoken the word?
That's the whole point for a word of the day, is to go out there and use it. So we take it from the written page in my wonderful dictionary and put it into the vocabulary of our listeners.
Put it into practice. So from the news piece from the Wall Street Journal, pointedly in a break with indirect pronouncements of past summits, the recent summit between Russia and China criticized the U.S. by name 6 times in their statement, taking issue with its alliances with Australia and others in Asia and its arms control and other policies. It also opposed any expansion by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a central demand from Russia in its standoff with the West over Ukraine. The opposition to NATO marked China's most explicit support to date of Russia in the confrontation, and international affairs specialists said showed Beijing's ambition to have a say in European security and its closest alignment with Russia since the early years of the communist bloc's Cold War with the rest. Now, Lance, for us young people out there, the communist bloc's Cold War with the rest, what the heck are we talking about, the communist bloc?
Well, back in the late 1950s, the real concern for the United States after Korean conflict, that the 2 new communist countries in the world who happen to be from the same region, China and the Soviet Union, i.e. Russia today, would join powers and they would become this superpower, or together would take down the United States. Then the Cold War starts, and then what happens is the leadership of those 2 communist countries decide that they don't like one another, that they both want the same thing, and they're not going to throw their hats into the ring together, and they are going to fight for their own supremacy against the United States, which then allowed the United States a much better chance at being successful, because we didn't really divide and conquer. They kind of did that themselves. They didn't want to get along. It's like, well, we're the Chinese and we want to do this. Well, we're the Russians and we want to do this. We're the Soviet Union. We want to do this. And they didn't put their powers together. And so when we're talking about this is the closest they've come since the pre-1950s, that's what we're talking about. That's what we're saying, is that these 2 communist countries who you might have thought historically have, lack of better saying, been in bed together because they had this communism thing in common.
Now they're both republics, though.
Have not been, right? They have not been. And now they're going to take their powers and put them together to take on the United States. So it's kind of an interesting situation, especially for us older people, because it's like, really, these two countries don't like one another. But here's where they're taking their opportunity, right? Russia and China, this is a quote from the article, Russia and China are making common cause to better defend their respective interests and their authoritarian systems from Western pressure. So the idea being that they both want to continue to exist, and they've decided that the best way for them to exist from the United States and NATO and those countries saying, your humanitarian things that you're doing and the way you're trying to control gas prices and you're trying to start wars, yeah, well, you can't do that anymore. That's bad. And they're saying, so all these Westerners are attacking us and they're attacking you. So let's come together to fight that.
So the meeting took place last Friday. Obviously, it's coming at a time where we've got some pretty high tensions between the United States, our allies, and China and Russia, both individually and now collectively, right? And I'm sure some of it comes from that too, right? They're feeling some pressure. They know that for the last several years at, midway through the Trump administration and obviously into the Biden administration, things have not been as cozy, particularly with China. Russia, obviously, we've seen a marked shift in since Biden has taken over as president. But now they're both kind of in this, lukewarm position at best with us, knowing that things are headed in a distasteful direction. So what do? Well, they do what people do when they're backed against the wall, right? And they look for somebody else to help them or to divert attention to. So obviously, I think they know this will frustrate the United States and our allies. But it also has that added benefit of showing that they're not alone. And that some of our efforts, particularly, you might say, why is this timing important? Well, if you've listened recently, right, the episode about Ukraine and Russia and what might happen there, it's very important in regards to that because some of the U.S. efforts that we have indicated, which would be more severe, basically economically than we've ever done before, things like, for example, disabling part of the integral international banking system that makes transferring money possible with Russian banks. We've never done that before. That would be a big deal. However, China has kind of indicated, yeah, we're not going to do that. So you guys can do it, but we may let them run through our own system that we've developed. That then basically, yes, it's an extra step, but you could siphon your money into accounts in China, and then those Chinese accounts could bypass basically the block that the United States is putting on you so that you could get it to the rest of the world again. So there's that issue, right? All by itself. And that's part of, I think, the high tensions right now at this time are knowing that if they're, rubbing shoulders, that makes it a lot harder for the United States to exert the type of influence it wants to exert without indicating military influence, right? And what I mean is specifically supporting Ukraine directly by, putting troops there or continuing to provide supplies, those sorts of things that may not directly deal with China. But all of the other things that we've talked about, the things basically that the Biden administration has signaled it wants to do, right? It does not want to put troops into Ukraine. It does not want to, get overly involved directly in Ukraine, but it wants to keep Russia from going in there. So it's looked at these other options that it has. And China said, well, we're not sure we're going to let you do some of those options.
Well, and the biggest part here to me is, as the article points out, this is a fundamental shift of foreign policy for China, because for the last 4 decades, China's foreign policy has centered on building its relationship with the United States. And so this is, this tightening of ties with Moscow from this evidence from the statement is just a big change in that. I mean, they're doubling down and saying, okay, well, we've tried to work with you over the last 40 years and we're not going to anymore. We're going to tie our apron strings to the Russians and to Putin. And you wonder, how much President Donald Trump's trade war against Beijing helped them decide to do this. We had all that when Trump was president, and we were all excited because he was standing up to China. Has this led them to say, well, you know what? We're not getting anywhere with you guys. So economically, we need Russia. And you say, well, why do they need Russia? Well, according to this article, China is Russia's largest trading partner. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean that other countries don't spend more money with China, but Russia spends more money with China than anything else. And what does Russia have that China needs? They have energy.
Right. What they care about is, I think, two major components. Number one is the expansion of the West, right? I mean, and the West referring collectively kind of to the United States and our European allies. They don't like to see that pushed. So when Russia's looking to do something that at the very least, diminishes that progression or slows that progression, that's a good thing. I mean, that's a positive, right, in China's view. But the other big thing is the direct benefit to them, right, which to Lance's point is the economic side of what does China need to keep growing towards surpassing the United States as the world's most powerful economy? Well, they need to keep expanding. Well, how do you expand? Well, they become a manufacturing powerhouse. And in order to manufacture stuff, Lance, you need a lot of power.
Yes,
right?
you do.
Energy. You need energy to make stuff. And guess what Russia has? Well, they have those things, especially more conventional forms of energy, right? Oil, natural gas. They have that stuff in abundance. So there's a very, again, China very much brass tacks, right? And wanting to know about what does it do for them? And it does those two things. Does China necessarily want Russia to take Ukraine? I get the feeling, Lance, from the article, not necessarily. They don't necessarily love that Russia is doing this. And we're going to talk about kind of that and expand on it a little bit more. But let us know your thoughts so far, because you've taken all this in. Great. We understand some of the reasoning. So what should the United States do about this, if anything? Or should we just say, oh well? And that's not a rhetorical question. We genuinely want to know. So send us an email, podcast@thestateofus.org, and let us know your thoughts. We're going to keep talking about the Russia and China situation, how they're trying to push the United States aside, and what we should do about that. To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. We left off, Lance, in talking about the reality that China probably isn't actually supportive directly of the idea of Russia taking back Ukraine. And I say taking back Ukraine, I guess historically that's a little tricky because, you could argue, well, where's the starting point? Because, at one point, obviously it was just tribes that roamed the area, and then the early days of the Russian monarchy and and have they always been part of Russia? Well, it depends on where you start, right? And the Soviet Union and the breakup. And so we're talking about modern history, right? Ukraine used to be part of the Soviet Union. Obviously, upon the breakup, it was not. And so that's what we're talking about when we say when Russia, and we're referring to taking it back. Despite the fact that Ukraine not really very interested in that. They really don't. They really don't want that.
Your question, and we know with the oil, there are a couple of pipelines that are being built from Russia into China. There's cooperation for a better nuclear power plants.
What about military tech,
to be built? And so there's a lot of stuff that way. But when you talk about it, and I know you don't like this necessarily, you haven't in the past, but the power of sanctions, if the United States should decide to sanction Russia or parts of its financial sector or impose exports on semiconductors, as we did with how you pronounce that? Huawei Technologies?
Huawei.
Okay, Huawei. It's H-U-A. Come on, you got to anglicize it. Sorry about that, folks. We've done that. Then China would be kind of hard pressed in offering support, because then that would hurt what they want, and that is to grow their economy. So I think this might be a case where we could sanction the Russians and hurt Putin, and at the same time force China to back out, because those sanctions would not only hurt Russia, but they would also hurt the Chinese. And this is why, they're getting together, not because, like you said, these two countries aren't getting together because all of a sudden they like each other and they want to sit around the campfire and sing Kumbaya. They're getting there because they both think that they can further what they want to do. And I think China might be a little exasperated if the Americans come after the Russians in a way that would hurt the Chinese economically, because I think that's the number one thing in China's mind, is that they want to become that economic leader in the world. And they're on the cusp of doing that, and they need the energy, but they're still not there, and they don't want to upset the United States, because they still need some things from the United States, as well as from Russia and other countries, to reach their goal.
I think part of the challenge with sanctions, which I've reiterated before, is for the citizens of the world, seeing their direct effects is sometimes a challenge. And not sometimes, it's frequently a challenge. Now, broader sweeping sanctions, these types, yes. But the main reason that I'm leery of sanctions is because, and we've talked about this before, especially with Russia, the people that always get hit the hardest, it seems like, by the things that we sanction Russia on are the citizens of Russia. And I know the thinking goes right. And I mean, there's people out there with, degrees in international politics and foreign relations and this kind of stuff who are going to tell me that it's more complicated than that. And I understand that it is, but from a standpoint of trying to explain this to listeners, right? The issue here, or the thinking goes, that if you hurt the people get upset. The leaders have to maintain some semblance of order among the people in order to stay in power. So therefore, when the people are hurt, it does help serve your benefit, even though obviously in the short term they have to suffer. The I guess counter to that I would contend is that in Russia, we have to remember that their media is state controlled. So what most people consume is the message that the government wants them to consume, which means that when we place sanctions on them, the reasons why are vastly distorted, or sometimes just totally dropped altogether. And we're made to be out the boogeyman, and the government made to be the hero for the Russian people. And so the purpose of some of our sanctions often are lost on, not because the people of Russia are dumb at all, but because if you don't have access to the information, you can't be expected to take action on it. So it's not to say that it doesn't hurt Putin or his friends or the other cronies, right? It's not to say that there's not an effect there. It is to say that when you hurt the people, I'm leery of that, because I'm not sure we're getting what we think we're getting. I think we convince ourselves that it's going to be a good solution. And I think history has played out that, generally speaking, its effect is not nearly as great as I think we'd all hope that it would be.
But in this case, if you attack China's economy, I think that's the best place to hit them, because that's what they're interested in. And that's
why they're doing this.
I would support it in this case. But to your point of what's going on militarily, well, Russia and China in the last few months have staged joint military exercises, and they had a feature that coordinated their command centers, and Moscow has been willing to transfer technology that it once guarded. Also, they've worked together against the U.S. alliances. Like we know, one of the reasons that Putin's against U.S. intervention in Ukraine is because the stick being held out there that Ukraine could join NATO. And China said, yeah, we shouldn't do that. And Putin on the other side says, we're with China. We don't think the United States should be having this Indo-Pacific grouping that it has with Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States.
So several different components going into play. And I know that was one that I thought was interesting because it was kind of the lesser point to it all. But the reality is it's very hard for us all to know how important of a component that one is to China. Because I think people assume that being the world's second most powerful economy automatically puts China in the world's second most powerful military position, but really that's not true. I mean, generally speaking. Now, yes, China has a lot of people, right? A lot of human beings that are in their military, but that's really where a lot of their power comes from. There's some great stuff out there from very reliable sources where you can read about the true disparity between the United States and Chinese militaries. And arguably speaking, the disparities, even though Russia has far less manpower, so to speak, one of the things that's not well covered, and I was talking to some people the other day, that are familiar with our military, saying that, a common line of thinking is that we really don't, maybe at the top levels of our military, they have a good idea, but we don't know how much advancement Russia's made because they've not been doing a big job of showing it all off, kind of like they used to, right? The big parades, think North Korea, right? And they're, let's flaunt this and make sure the world believes that we have it, even if it doesn't work, right? Or the United States force field, to keep out the nukes and stuff, right? I mean, the days of that are not gone, but Russia has definitely taken a marked different approach over the past few decades, despite the fact that we know they're investing, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars into their military. So that money's doing something, right? What it's doing is still the subject for the everyday citizen like us of some debate. So the point that I'm getting at here is we don't want to, I think it's a disservice to say that it's only an economic thing, right? Which Lance and I haven't done. I mean, we're noting that it's military. The challenge is we don't know how much of this is military. And I think, to your point, Lance, maybe that's part of why you do the sanctions. Because if we do the sanctions and they hold strong and are sticking together elbow to elbow, now we've learned something, right? I mean, part of what we've learned is that there's more than meets the eye to, it's not just about the economics. The economics may be part of it, but obviously there's something else being gained here by China. And that may very well be, and almost assuredly is, advancements in China's military technology, which I think, more so than the economic component, right, that maybe should concern us more than anything. So now, of course, then, well, what do we do about it, Lance? So we do the sanctions, but the military stuff keeps taking place. What do we do? I mean, do we do nothing?
Well, but now we don't know because we don't, and I know we have to have a plan or an idea, but we don't know the sanctions might stop the military stuff.
It might. And I guess here's where I come in as the old person. I really don't see China and Russia joining together. I think this is more of just a show. And I can't see them agreeing. A grip and grin?
Yeah, I can't see them agreeing on anything. If they do, we're in trouble. I guess that's where my point is. This is something that since I started studying this region of the world back in high school, back in the 70s, that I was always concerned about. If these two powers go together, is there a whole lot that the United States can do? And this is why my generation was worried about nuclear annihilation, because I'm not sure what we can do when you put what the Russians have militarily with the manpower and the economics that the Chinese have. There's not a whole lot to avoid World War III in my mind if you want to stop this. And I'm not trying to be, blustering or anything else. That's why the United States, and I believe Richard Nixon in the 70s, went to China to try to open up relations. And we fought the Cold War against the Soviet Union because we were working friendship with one while we were trying to get communism done in the other. And it worked. And now what we're dealing with is, okay, now they're both, to your point, authoritarian republics. And we've tried to work with China until we got to President Trump. And then we said, well, we're not going to let this trade go. And so China now has turned to Russia. And in order to get something from Russia, money, supplies that the Chinese need to grow their economy, China is being asked by Putin to support our military endeavors in the Ukraine. If that actually goes through, I don't like the prospects of what we might have to do.
What do you all think? Send us an email, podcast@thestateofus.org. What do I think about what Lance has to say? Well, to find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. Why is Ukraine a big deal when we talk about Russia and China? Well, I think Lance started to peel back the scab there and explain that the main reason it's a big deal is because it's a test of how far we're willing to let them go before we say, nope, you can't do that. Now, we're saying, we're doing our classic for the last 20, 30 years, last couple of decades, the classic wagging the finger American way at, how dare you, don't do that. Bad, bad, bad. The question is, how are we going to back that up? Because as we know, the thing is, I think that worked for a little while, right? In my study of more recent history, why did it work? Why did the wagging of the finger work? Well, I think it's because we had proven to the world in the 20th century, right, the 1900s, that we would go to war. And not only would we go to war, but we'd, kick your butt. I mean, if we were going to come play, then you were by God going to do what we had told you, or we were going to come kill you. That was basically, not to be, too harsh with it, but that's pretty much. There was reason to believe, to fear the United States wagging their finger at you, World War I, World War II, right? The Korean War, which arguably didn't, end in a definitive other than that, to China's dismay, we have some 30,000 American troops sitting right near their doorstep in a major ally, South Korea, and untold military arsenal capabilities in South Korea. So was the war a big success in terms of the North and South Korea, the Korean War component? Yeah, that's a different conversation. But what it was a success in is a major strategic military stronghold in that part of the world, and a great new ally, right? So there's a big benefit there. Then you had some blunders, right? Vietnam, I'm thinking mainly, not so good, and then we've had in more recent years, wars that are very questionable in terms of measuring the support and effectiveness of them on a world scale, right? Iraq, Afghanistan, the Gulf War, things that, again, they're not like World War II, where it's like, no, we won, we won, they lost, and we told them how the world was going to be, basically. Is that unfair, Lance? I think yes, there was more nuance than that, but generally speaking.
No, in one place we did take out a leader and put something in, if you could argue whether it's more stable or not. We have kept oil prices down, which was, there was talk for those of you that are a little bit younger of, gasoline prices going to $10, $15 a gallon, and are interceding in the Middle East and putting the economic pressure on some of these oil producing countries, has kept oil at a relatively cheap price. I know I say that in the realms of people paying over $3, pushing $4 a gallon in some parts of the country with inflation.
But it could be 7 or 8,
but it could
or
be
15.
It could be that if you want to go back and check before we got involved. So did we accomplish our goals? I think that becomes, well, what were our goals? We didn't state that it was to keep oil prices down. I always thought that was one of the main reasons. We never stated that we were going to, take out terrorism and all those kinds of things, which was what made the public feel happy. But I don't know how you take out terrorism, because terrorism by its nature is hard to get rid of, And so I think we accomplished more than what you led, than kind of what you said, but it was not those things that we said we were going to accomplish. We didn't, rightfully so, we didn't accomplish those to the level that the government told the American people, but I think there were some subsidiary issues that we did accomplish what we were looking to do.
Well, to be clear, I don't want to suggest that we didn't have successes in those areas. I guess more what I'm suggesting is the picture, right? What comes to mind, our listeners out there, and you can send us an email, podcast@thestateofus.org, when I say victory in World War II, right? Well, you probably got the classic like Green Army soldier, American, right? Marching by the tens of thousands with tanks and jeeps and infantry, and a very clear image of American military strength, right? What I guess I'm getting at is in these other conflicts, it's not...
I just want to point something out real quickly, and I'll let you go back to it.
Yeah.
Who were two of our allies in that war? The Soviet Union and China. Just to make the circle, but go ahead.
Right.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm finding that very ironic that you chose that one to talk about.
Yeah.
And the Soviets and the Chinese were two of our major allies that a lot of people don't realize.
Yeah, they don't.
They can name England and that kind of. But yeah, there you go.
Well, because for example, right, when we were doing our counterattack against Japan, we had bombers that bailed out and landed in China as the safe haven after having hit Japan. Anyway, side note on history, right? But I guess the point that I was getting at is in terms of a classic world signal, and even to our allies like Russia and China, right? The images, the reports, the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of American troops marching through the landscape and taking territory. Again, whether or not the success was the same, proportionally speaking, people are people, right? And even leaders like President Xi, President Putin, those things matter to people, right? Because seeing that happen, seeing hundreds of thousands of American troops, hundreds of thousands of, all manner of military infrastructure, is any of that as powerful as a nuclear weapon? In terms of raw strength, no. In terms of the mental image, it's a tough one, and I guess what I'm getting at there is I think part of the reason that our wagging the finger seems to have diminished in recent years and the sanctions and this stuff is because it's been, everybody that's in charge right now was either very, very young or wasn't even born when any of that took place. So that goodwill, quote unquote, that's maybe not the right phrasing for it, but that, whatever that is, that merit that we had built up, that street cred, of there's big trouble to pay if you don't obey, I think a lot of that has kind of fallen away from just a sheer benefit. What does the United States stand to benefit from having Ukraine as a close ally? Well, we don't need anything that they have, right? We don't need their farmland. We don't need their oil. So, they're very corrupt economy, It's not like it's a great vacation spot. Again, what exactly does the United States gain with this? Well, the only real thing we gain, right, is standing up to Russia. That's basically what you gain.
Well, I think that's what exasperates us so much as Americans is like, well, why don't you respect us? Don't you know what we did? Don't you know how we either hurt your country or helped your country? And you point out that, well, the people that are in charge now, unless they study history, no, they don't know that. And I think that's where the Ukraine, though, maybe becomes that wedge that we drive between Russia and China to get them to back off of this, air quotes here, newfound friendship. Because I really don't think it's a deep-seated liking of one another. I think they've joined together to try to achieve what they want against the United States, but they don't necessarily support one another. And I think making a stand in the Ukraine could be, as I said, that wedge that starts to go between Russia and China and gets them back to dealing with the United States separately, because China doesn't want to give up what they get from the United States over something like the Ukraine. And right now, China's economy depends so much on the United States and us buying things from them that they're not willing to lose that economic power over the Ukraine. So for the United States to stand up to Russia over the Ukraine will then force the Chinese government to decide, well, do we really want to support Russia? Because we as the Chinese are more important to Russia than Russia is to us.
Yeah, because if the United States, either way, right, not a big loss for us. Because if in the meantime, maybe we get some oil and gas from, and maybe some military tech from Russia, so that's good. I mean, it's a win for China.
Some short-term gains here.
If the United States gets too angry, then we can just back off and forget about it. And if they don't, then great, because now
maybe we can start to push it in other areas of the world that are important to us.
Hence the reason why, as we've talked about before, people don't pay attention to international politics, partly because they are, unfortunately, a complicated web of a lot of different interests moving around. And so it's much easier to focus on, what Marco Rubio said this week that was inflammatory, or what he did not say, and Mike Pence's comments about, Trump and the election, and all of that's much simpler and more fun to talk about than everything that we've tried to cover in today's episode. But why did we have this conversation, Lance? Because it wasn't just to exasperate our listeners, was it? It was to actually make, hopefully, take some meaning out of all this.
Well, our mission here at True Chat is to educate people, and we've done that. We've gone and given you some background. We've given you some of the nuances that exist in this relationship, and we've done it by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And we hope that you've enjoyed that, and you've enjoyed it enough that you share it with your family and your friends at work. And as you're sitting around the water cooler and talking, or you're on your latest Zoom meeting and talking to one another, and you mention us, they say, well, where can we listen to these guys? It sounds like I can be very informed and learn some things that are going on that I don't find in the national media. Well, you tell them. You can find us as a podcast on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us is available Tuesdays and Thursdays as a podcast, first thing in the mornings, and we're heard on radio stations across the country on the weekends. For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I think I took the victory today. Justin won't mention it, but I think I won. He is exasperated to the point that he wouldn't announce the winner.
Oh, you think so?
And so I'm Lance Jackson.
I think I had it all tied up, but we'll leave the producer extraordinaire Bradley Bush to make the final decision and make sure that the victory goes to the rightful winner. Thank you all. Hopefully, thank you, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.